Yes, so we'll do our introduction and territorial acknowledgement as usual. I'm based out of Calgary, but since this event is hosted through the University of Waterloo, we'll do the Waterloo one. There'll be our panel style questions and answers and discussion. Feel free to put your questions in our Q&A box, and then some will be answered via typing, but we hope that the majority of the questions will get answered live as our panelists discuss them, and then we'll do some closing remarks at the end. That may be 5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes. Perfect. So REAC, you might have heard of us. We're the recent Engineering Alumni Council made up of volunteer Waterloo Engineering alumni working to support the strategy, design, and implementation of a stronger and more exciting young alumni program at Waterloo Engineering. So as engineers, our work will have a big impact. And so welcome and join us. We have some 2SLGBTQ plus Waterloo Engineering alum and current students today in a conversation about their journey, how they leverage and navigate their 2SLGBTQ plus and engineering identity, and the challenges facing this community and what we can do to support them. So let's do this territory acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of their work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university's main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. The university's active work towards reconciliation takes place across all campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is coordinated within the Office of Indigenous Relations. Since it's Pride Month and not all of us are based out of Waterloo. I personally am based out of Calgary. I encourage all of us to take some time this month to learn a bit more about the local Indigenous folk in the area that we are living, working, and playing in, and seeing what Pride-related things, efforts, events, funds we can support and donate to. So we're actively working towards reconciliation during Pride Month. So our speakers today, I'm super excited. These are all super amazing folks who are doing very different things in their engineering careers slash student life, but they all share one lens, which is that they're all 2S LGBTQ plus folk. So I'm super excited to welcome Michelle. Michelle uses ill, they, them pronouns and is a lawyer, professional engineer, speaker, activist, policy consultant, researcher. They basically do everything. As a queer, non-binary, racialized, and neurodivergent person, Michelle's focus across their undertakings is on using their subject matter knowledge and lived experience to influence individuals, organizations, and systems to advance social justice. So yay, welcome, Michelle. Ali Kennington, they, them, is an environmental engineer in training at Atkins Realis, formerly SNC Lavalin in Ottawa. They specialize in hydrogeology, site assessment and remediation, and environmental regulation compliance. Their research focuses on enhancing the inclusion of diverse and marginalized users in their Masters of Applied Science and Civil Engineering through the empathetic engineering design process. So welcome, Ali. Arden is a Master's of Applied Science student in the Department of Management Science Engineering, and she also graduated from the University of Waterloo in 2023. So she's a former 2-term president of the University of Waterloo's branch of ENGIqueers, and was a recipient of the Lou Kennington Award for the 2S LGBTQ plus engineering community in 2022. So welcome, Arden. And then Tessa, our last and final panelist, uses any pronouns. They're a current mechanical engineering student at the University of Waterloo and has been president of ENGIqueers before, a lead of MEC mentorship, and is currently a team lead of Waterloo Rocketry, as shown by this super cool photo of them. So they hope to share their insights on bringing student leadership to professional environments, as well as how to balance their safety with public visibility. So very excited to welcome you all today. Well, you now know all of our speakers. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring them. But we can probably start, and maybe I'll stop sharing my screen so you can see everyone's faces as we discuss. Perhaps everyone can take a minute or so to just talk about your experience in engineering as a member of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, and sort of how, the journey from maybe being a beginning engineering student to where you are now has changed your experience. Who would like to start? Michelle?
I thought we were going to go in reverse order of age, but okay. So hi everyone, good evening. My name is Michelle. As you've heard, they them pronouns. What didn't come up in my bio is that I'm also a Waterloo alum, obviously. Did my undergrad and master's in civil engineering at Waterloo, and I've stayed involved, obviously, throughout my undergrad and master's, as well as now as an alum. And what also didn't come up in my intro is why I went to law school after 2 degrees in engineering and landing some pretty good jobs. And as you can imagine, leaving a well-paying job to go back to school as a mature student was not an easy decision. And I did it really mostly out of spite. Out of the anger that I accumulated from my encounters with, not only racism, but also homophobia, ableism, and different forms of gender-based violence in engineering throughout my career. And all the times that people would make fun of me for complaining, people would gaslight me. And when I would raise employment law or human rights issues, people would be like, what are you, a lawyer? So I was like, you know what? That's a great idea. So I think that paints maybe a sort of rough picture of my experience in engineering as a member of the 2SLGBTQ plus community. And this is really not to single out any, organization or institution. It's really sort of a systemic cultural issue across the board. And so I think we've really got a long way to go. Um, and maybe with that, I'll just wrap up with a trigger warning for the session. I will discuss perhaps some stuff that may be, challenging for folks to hear. And so if you need to mute the call at any point or leave the call altogether, please feel free to do so and do what feels safe to you. Thanks for having me.
Allie, I think you're next in the age roulette.
Yes, valid. Cool. Thanks for picking me next, Adele. Thanks for the wonderful introductions. Um, I remember entering my undergrad in 2014 and kind of honestly expecting the worst just by virtue of entering a new environment with so many different people, kind of not really having an understanding of what it would be like living with 3 other people in residence. And what I experienced was, on some hands, kind of lucky in that it was really just like a don't ask, don't tell environment where the few times where I would share my sexual orientation or that kind of um, identity would be brought up, it would kind of be brushed over, and there wasn't overt violence or overt harassment, but it definitely felt quite isolating in that way. Um, and I recall, my classmates being pretty avoidant of that, even as we developed into some tighter knit groups. Um, and it wasn't until really a couple years into my undergrad that I started noticing, as I was traversing other areas of campus, going to the EIT building for geology courses, or arts buildings occasionally to find a quieter room to study, seeing various safe space stickers on profs' windows or other offices. And I thought that just set quite a tone for the environment. And yeah, I feel that kind of don't ask, don't tell. We're not really going to try to welcome anything outside of the status quo or talk about what that might mean. I feel like that carried through into my career in engineering.
I
Arden,
think
are
I'm
you?
next in the
Yes.
age order. Yeah. Hi, so I'm Arden. My pronouns are she, her. I first came to Waterloo in September of 2018 as a undergraduate student in the management engineering program. And when I first came here, I thought I was a straight cis man. And it took about 2 months for that to slowly start crumbling. And when I started coming to terms with my sexuality and my gender, I sort of thought I was a bit screwed because Waterloo is known for engineering and math. I thought like that kind of environment would be terrible. And so I think I set my expectations quite low, and I've been pleasantly surprised by my department, the Department of Management Science and Engineering. It's been pretty welcoming among the staff and among friends. And I'm very grateful for that. And I think that sort of welcoming environment that I got to see in my department sort of encouraged me to sort of push a bit further and be more open and advocating for queer people and queer students in general. As for now, I'm doing my master's. I'm still in the Department of Management Science and Engineering, and my research is in human-computer interaction, and specifically are talking about data visualization. And I think data is a very interesting space, especially when it comes to data and identity, because there is a lot of issues with bias and with missing data and how data is skewed in certain ways. And it's like this interesting intersection, not like a fun intersection, but an interesting one for me personally, talking about this sort of the intersection of data and I guess intersectionality.
Yeah, cool. I'm the baby. I'm Tessa. I use any pronouns, n'importe quel. Yeah, started mechanical engineering in 2021, which is not that long ago. I'm currently a second year student, took some time off for extra long co-ops. Um, and yeah, uh, unlike Arden, knew that I was not a straight cis man when I showed up. I came out in sort of near the end of high school, um, and I think also similar to Arden, prepared for the worst. Um, Mechanical engineering is not known for its diversity. I looking at the like women in engineering numbers and seeing that mechanical engineering is right at the bottom at a solid 17% was a little bit worrying to me. But yeah, after actually showing up here and meeting some really lovely people, I've also definitely been pleasantly surprised and managed to worm my way into a lot of interesting environments. Running Queers last winter was particularly interesting. Meeting a lot of really interesting queer people and then organizing groups between different queer organizations on campus. Organizing hangouts there was really fun. Um, Doing a lot of support inside of mechanical engineering to other queer students, mostly through Mech Mentorship, a student-run like peer mentorship program. So being able to like find queer people there and talk to them and sort of how it's going. And and then also, yeah, I've about a year ago found myself as one co-lead of the Waterloo rocketry team and have done a lot of aerospace work. It just came from an aerospace job and moving into another more aerospace job. Um, and yeah, finding myself in a lot of traditional engineering environments and having to navigate being queer and being a woman in those kinds of spaces.
Thank you all for sharing. I'm actually really interested in the fact that like you can see the progression and sort of your experience over time, like starting with Michelle and feeling like it kind of sucked to the point where you came back as a lawyer to say like screw you to all these people, to where Arden and Tessa talking about how it was really different for them. Um, I'm curious, like from a more like systems level, what really, if you could comment, maybe each of you, on maybe what has really changed at Waterloo Engineering or engineering in general that has made that experience so different. And Michelle, like you started real a long time, not a long time ago, but far earlier than say
You
like
can be honest, that's
2021.
okay.
Yeah, anything jumps to mind about what systematically changed that would have made that has made your experience different?
You want to go with me again, or did you want to go backwards this time? I'm gonna make Tessa go first.
You, yeah, I think that I'm having a good time now because exactly one thing has changed, which is that the the balance has barely shifted enough for like homophobia to no longer be socially acceptable. Like I'm not actually convinced that that many more people are like more accepting or open or vocal in their acceptance of queer people today. I just think that it's just enough that the social punishment for being homophobic or transphobic outweighs the social benefit. I don't actually know where the threshold is. Like, I don't know if it's 70% or 50% or 30%. But I saw that especially near the end of high school, like in grade 9 and 10. Um, I recall a lot more like casual homophobia, I guess, the kinds of jokes that you hear that are funny if you're straight and alienating if you're queer. Um, like those just kind of vanished. And I think that was because people started getting called out on it. Like people started being interrogated, like, why do you find that funny? And then the social cost of doing that just became too high. Um, very interesting transition to witness. I'm curious if the rest of you have seen a similar transition in your social environments. Um, like if you've been at the same workplace and that sort of stuff has faded out the way I saw it disappear over high school. And then showing up at university, I've caught a few things, but only when people didn't think I was listening. Uh, and honestly, that's fine. Like I'm not exposed to it regularly. I can handle it. Like I just kind of get to live my life. So yeah, very curious to hear where the rest of the panelists have noticed that shift, or if you've noticed the same thing.
I don't have too much to add other than to say that I wish that I could see a similar shift in the workplace. I think that there's sorry, I have the hesitancy only because I feel like I haven't been in one place long enough, and there's not as much in-person interactions to kind of get those kind of quips. But this does make me think of somebody I've connected with on LinkedIn who used to be a director of geotechnical engineering at WSP, and now she's moved to another company whose name I forget. But she posted this like quite scathing situation that she was in at a recent conference where some senior engineer cis male at the table made quite a homophobic remark, and nobody at this table spoke up or called out or anything like that. And so I think that your observation is pretty sound in younger generations, and I think that when I'm back on campus for different events or just passing through or talking to students, I do feel like there's a lot more acceptance, or at least understanding that it's not the place to make terrible jokes. And I think that that'll eventually keep making its way up the ranks and make better progress for us.
Yeah, this sounds like a culture, like a culture change. And there's this in an organization, any sort of space, there's the question of, does culture come from the bottom and percolate up to shift upwards, or does it come from the top people and percolate down through the rest? And to a certain extent, I feel like it's sort of happening in both ends, and I don't know which one started first, but like when I was in high school, and for context, I'm from BC, so high school starts in grade 8. Um, so I remember in the band in my band room there was a poster that says "gay is not an insult," and I was honestly very ignorant of sort of queerness in general, and so I was just like I wasn't really aware of that much, but like going from there to now I'm seeing high schoolers or like first years who are very comfortable talking about their sexuality or talking about sexuality and gender and stuff like that. Like it's just like such a like for me, I'm sort of surprised still because when I was in grade 12, I'm like, I think there were a few people who like one or two people who weren't openly out in any way, but people sort of had an idea and it wasn't really mentioned that much. So like that shift, at least in like high schoolers and first years or like, lower years is something that I've noticed. But also, I think one of the things that has changed at Waterloo is that policies and people have also started shifting. So now that there are people in positions of authority, not all of them, but some of them that do are more open about and being supportive. And um, and so from there, they can start enacting these policies. And I think it's sort of this top-down policies and people at the top start changing. And also the younger ones are also starting to change. And so it's sort of permeating through like that. I remember I'm thinking about stuff like the way process of changing your name in systems. The University of Waterloo apparently is very good when it comes to distinguishing between a legal name and a preferred name. And the process of changing names has gotten a lot easier because when I was changing my name, there was a PhD student who sort of reached out to me and she was like, "Hey, I had a friend who changed their name. And it was honestly worse trying to change their name through the university systems than it was like legally. But by the time that I got around to it, it was actually very quick because they had implemented this program that would find all these instances and try to do it in a nice, easy way. And so by the time that I got into it, I was like, oh, that was pretty quick. So I do see this shift happening both in like from yeah, like both ends. And there's still issues. Like obviously there's going to be people who are terrible in this sense, but I think they recognize, like Tessa said, that they are in the minority and shouldn't say those opinions publicly or they will be punished. But yeah.
Yeah, like before homophobic being homophobic gained you respect, and now it loses respect. That's all it takes.
So at risk of sounding like the grumpy old person here, that's okay, I can be that. I as much as I think there's been obviously a lot of progress, we've come a long way from like the 1600s where we used to hang people for sodomy and other queer acts, all the way to the criminalization and then the decriminalization and all of these sort of milestones that we've reached in the last several decades, centuries. I think we are backpedaling a little bit at the systemic level, not at the organizational or within engineering industries, but I mean at the systemic societal level. I really do think that, and as I wanted to title the panel as, proud but precarious, I think that there is sort of that precarious reality, setting in, and it's kind of creeping in slowly. And I think, a lot of it is happening somewhat quietly. Um, this divisive and, individualist and, very hate sort of based mindset. I think these are really on the rise across Canada, just like in the US and arguably perhaps the rest of the world. And, the rights, safety, and dignity of many equity seeking groups, not just queer people and trans people and non-binary people, are really on the rise, I think, and are more at risk than ever in a long time. And I think, if we just think about the last 2 years alone, again, Adele, you asked about the systemic level, so I'm going to the systemic level. We've seen hundreds of hate motivated protests targeting really already marginalized groups, whether it be the 33, coordinated national anti-trans protests that took place last fall, like one in Ottawa, Ali and I went to it, or the really, the white supremacist, fascist, ableist freedom convoy that again occupied the city I live in, the capital, for over a month, right? That included, the harassment of and really violence against queer people, 2SLGBTQ plus people, as well as racialized, disabled, equity seeking people in general. And as I wrote in the event description here, CSIS, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, has actually identified the anti-2SLGBTQ plus movement as one of the greatest domestic terrorism threats facing our country now and for years to come. And they cited the attack on the gender studies class that took place here at Waterloo. Well, there at Waterloo, I'm not there, but back just last year, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, just last year. It's happening now as among the examples of, quote, extreme violence against the 2SLGBTQ plus community or against other targets they view as representing the gender ideology agenda, right? So that's sort of, I think, a good illustration of sort of, some of the going backwards that's been happening. And then I think the other thing I want to note is really sort of the ways that our elected decision makers, I think, I'm glad to hear that young engineering students are behaving themselves, but I think, some of our elected decision makers are really conducting themselves in a way that really concerns, I think, me and a lot of people. I think, instead of addressing some of the big issues facing our country, like the housing crisis, the state of our healthcare system, the cost of living, a lot of politicians are really taking cheap shots at already vulnerable groups like trans youth, right? And other LGBTQ plus groups, different other equity seeking communities, to sow division, to pit us against each other and, so they can gain power, be voted into office, right? So I think there is sort of, something that we should be aware of at the systemic level, as much as, on the ground, things seem to be getting better. And I'm, delighted to hear that. But I think, we need to sort of be vigilant about what's going on and especially the legal and policy landscape.
I mean, oh, go ahead, Arden.
Oh yeah, no, I was gonna say like that is true. Like if you asked me maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, like how do you think Waterloo, like the university is gonna do as an institution when it comes to stuff like this? I would have been like, oh, it's great. It's gonna go up and there will be some bumps, but it's gonna go up. And if you ask me, well, how about the country? I'll be like, so there is this microcosm I think is doing okay, but I think I do agree that if you take like a larger step back, I am concerned for the next 5, 10 years. Like the pendulum's been swinging in one direction and it's starting to feel some backwards, some pushing back, and that's like it's concerning. Mhm.
No, for sure. And I think this is probably a good time. Like we've talked about some positive things, which is yay, Pride celebration. And we're talking about the ongoing persecution of this community. And it feels like a lot of the time it's like, you're the community, like advocate for yourself, figure it out. But like, there are allies and folks. And so what could we do as an engineering community, perhaps, to better advocate and support the 2S LGBTQ plus community in times like right now, where it can feel like, weirdly enough, the culture from a larger picture is starting to swing back to this not inclusive and really hate-filled rhetoric.
I could start if you guys don't mind. I think the easiest thing to do is really just to speak about things, to talk about things, to acknowledge what's going on, to check in with your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends who might be impacted by things, whether because they're 2S LGBTQ plus or not. Whether they're in Ottawa during the convoy, or maybe they have kids who are being impacted by school protests, like that one in September. Or maybe they don't have any intersectionalities with these things, but I think keeping a dialogue of it keeps us aware, and helps kind of protest that division that Michelle mentioned, that where they're trying to, certain politicians might be trying to sow divisions. And so I think the easiest thing for allies or for members of the community to do, like I said, is really just to continue with these dialogues, especially for folks who are in those positions of power, or who have privilege, to lead those conversations, so that it's not junior employees or younger students who are having to try to speak up and figure out how they can elbow their way in and say, hey, I have these alternative needs, or this is really impacting me. I think that it goes for a lot of community building.
To speak on the point about people in positions of power, like I do want to mention, like I think people, when we hear the term position of power, we think of managers or bosses or leaders in some position. But I also mentioned that like there's a lot of different kinds of power. And for instance, like in a family, the oldest person is often a position of power. There's this idea of like the matriarch or the patriarch of a family. Like that person wields a certain amount of sway in their family. And if they say something like, "Oh, I'm fine with it. I'm fine with my great-granddaughter being gay and there's nothing wrong with it," and that sort of sends a message to the rest of the family. Or thinking about like in friend groups, perhaps the oldest person or the person that other people look up to. Like the thing is like, I feel like a lot of people might think I'm not in a position of power, but the answer is you probably have more power than you think you do. And so even for like the average person, just even they can have an effect on sort of their immediate acquaintances and friends and family. So I would say like don't go around thinking, oh, a position of power, that's not me. Everyone has, I think, like a certain amount of power, and of course, some people have tremendously more than others, but every voice does matter, especially to the people who you are close to.
All of your answers are so vague. I have three things. Um, if you work on human interfacing systems, and thinking especially about software systems, queer people will interface with your systems. If you have form that asks about gender, please run it by a queer person first. It's yeah. There's a website for this, just showcasing a bunch of different terrible ways to ask about gender. Um, Things like that. If you write documentation materials, like if you're writing textbooks, for example, it's very easy to genericize engineers as men, for example. Like, hypothetical scenario that you go talk to your boss and he responds, that's not necessary. So like human interfacing systems, if you're working with if you're just like designing technical solutions that interface with people, there will be queer people interfacing with your systems, and you should consider them and talk to queer people about how to best make that work. Second thing, my some of my best interactions in, especially like professionally, um, come from other people, including like cishet people who are comfortable enough and understand enough to like not make jokes at my expense, but like joke about trans people, for example, in ways that are like actually funny. I'm remembering fondly a coworker of mine from my most recent co-op, Matthew, who must have had some queer friends because he knew way too much about this, and was able to um, like make jokes about how I put in all of this effort to become a woman just to get like backhanded by misogyny when I was done. Like these are good, funny jokes. So if there are queer people around, then like give them space to talk about these things and like make them feel comfortable by demonstrating your understanding. If you don't have the understanding, you can go get it. Um, and then the third thing is a much more casual kind of visibility, but things like safe space stickers, they like sometimes feel a little tacky, but they are genuinely useful. It's quite not alienating, but it can be quite isolating to not see other queer people in the spaces that you're in. So like my boss having she, her, and they, them pronoun pins was really excellent. Um, and I would recommend to everyone, including like the cishetes, that sorry, the cisgender heterosexual people, the straight people in the audience, that you find a way to visually display that you explicitly support queer people.
I love that. Michelle, anything to add?
Trying to think of something that's, uh, you know, less on the critical side of things, but I guess just in terms of, what folks generally can do, whether you're an engineer or just a concerned citizen, is really to, I think we all have the social power that Arden mentioned, of speaking to your friends and raising awareness and, being the person that brings, up these topics and, when people are just making small talk and, let's talk about something real. I think I'm often that person, but I often do feel like a bit of a pest or downer, as you've maybe learned in this conversation. But I think it is really important that we keep doing it, that we keep bringing these things up and, centering them as critical issues of our time. And so I think there's that social sort of power piece, but then I think there's also the sort of power that we all inherently have as citizens, which is to vote. I think going out there to do that, which I know during my undergrad, a lot of my friends and classmates didn't really care about voting for some reason. I think a lot of, just as we often like to think that we're sort of neutral or objective in engineering, we often think that, politics are sort of, a little bit separate from the things that we care about, at least in my generation of engineering students. And that was certainly my perception. So I think, voting and, things like writing to your MPs or MPPs about, the bills that are popping up, about, your concerns about, the way that human rights are eroding, or the way that, gender neutral co-ed as they call them in Quebec, co-ed bathrooms in elementary schools and other, community spaces are being outlawed, writing to your elected representative about these things. I think that would go a really long way. Again, things that we would only learn about or talk about in engineering, but I think these are things that we can all do as citizens to become better, not just allies, but, to really move our society forward in a more sort of sound and reasonable direction.
I love this. I'm getting a lot of like small things, like even just visually displaying that you support the queer community, to really big things like voting, pushing your MPs, pushing your local elected officials. I do want to drill down maybe a little bit closer, just in the middle, to the workplace, since that's where a lot of engineers work up there, or work up, where a lot of engineers end up. And so are there things that or experiences you've had in the workplace that really jump to mind as either really positive examples of how to support or embrace the 2S LGBTQ plus community, or really negative and can be examples of like, please do not do this kind of thing. So that's, yeah, pick positive, negative. If I could just have one experience from everyone, I think that would be really illuminating.
So I
I'll
consulted
go.
with that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Arden.
No, you
No.
go ahead. You go ahead. Oh, okay, fine. So it's not my experience, but it is someone else's experience. I was listening to a panel at EQ back when we used to have those things before the pandemic. And panels for the record, just panels at EQ, just that that's what we used to have. We don't have that much anymore. But it was, like engineering alum or like upper years who were talking about their experiences with being like 2SLGBTQ plus in the workspace. And one of them, she had this she had this story. She was they one of the few people who was out at her workplace, and the higher ups were like, so I don't remember her name. We will call her Cheryl because that was the first thing that came to mind. So Cheryl, what can we as a workplace do for, the queers? Was sort of the question that she was asked. And her response was actually quite, actionable. It was like, okay, well, pronouns and email signatures. There's that one washroom that's single stall. That can be a gender neutral washroom, stuff like that. And then management was like, oh, well, the email signatures, that's an IT problem, but well, okay, sure. And the bathroom, we'll talk to like the people in charge of maintenance and buildings and stuff like that. Neither of them actually ended up happening. But instead, during Pride Month, there was this one day she shows up at her workplace, and there is this like package on her desk. And there are some people milling around her desk, and they're like, hey, Cheryl, do you want to open that package? And she's like, okay, opens it up, and it's just like some queer stuff. I don't know, rainbow socks or whatever. And it was like, this was their way of showing support for the queer community, was giving Cheryl a Pride t-shirt. So it was just. I guess the moral is don't do that. Like when you ask someone about what you should do, follow that instructions and don't just give this one person a gift. Listen to them and don't just do the thing that you think will be good. There's often this, yeah, there's just such a disconnect between what, queer people actually think would be useful and what, cishet people might think would be useful. There's often that disconnect. And so when you do notice that disconnect, I think it would be useful to think that you're wrong, or like you might need to change your thoughts and not, oh, this queer person is wrong, I'm going to give them a rainbow t-shirt instead. Like, meet them where they are. Don't bring them down. Bring them to your level. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think just, humility, right? I think that's sort of, and so what I was gonna say earlier was just that, I wanted to share some maybe best practices that I've recommended to different companies that have hired me to consult with their often HR folks and around policies, and then often they ask for best practices for their managers and executive leaders. So some of them are, always acknowledge and center the impact of discrimination. Don't gaslight, don't say, if somebody comes and tells you that they've experienced homophobia, racism, whatever it is, just accept it as true. I think there's not often, I think discrimination is alive and well. It's everywhere. It's all the time. And so if somebody's coming and raising it, they're likely not doing it for fun or for shits and giggles. It's because something happened. So just accept it as true. Be sensitive about the extra psychological load or invisible backpack or whatever you want to call it, that, this constant omnipresent discrimination creates for a lot of people who feel it, very deeply. So just be aware of that, and know that a lot of equity seeking folks are starting at a much more tired, exhausted place than others, and also to be prepared for your equity seeking employees or colleagues to tell you that they don't want to discuss something like, do you want some queer socks? They might be like, get away from me. I don't want to talk to you about it. Or that they're not prepared to discuss something on your timeline. Often, companies during June, for example, like right now, are like, Michelle, you're our most prized and valued employee. We would love to center you, after hours, unpaid. But we'd love to center you. And I might say like, no, thanks, right? Or no thanks on this date. I'd like to, if I'm going to do the company a service, I'd like it to be on my timeline. And they also might not be, willing to be tokenized, for example, like we just discussed. And so, your one queer employee might not want to be your Pride speaker. Like that's, allowed. Leave them alone. And be willing to admit that you made a mistake. So going back to the humility point, if you give a queer person some rainbow socks and they don't look too happy, just, accept that they maybe don't want queer socks or rainbow socks, and, to accept that you maybe made a mistake, or that you got your facts wrong, or that that you didn't actually educate yourself sufficiently before engaging in a conversation. If you get someone's pronouns wrong, similarly, just be willing to admit that you made a mistake, apologize, move on, right? And then some of the other points I think that I often recommend to engineering workplaces are really around not perpetuating the idea that emotions have no place in the workplace. I think often in engineering, especially, or in like science, STEM workplaces, we often think that we hang our our identities at the door, and we come in and we all sort of, are scientifically minded, and we're going to solve issues with just numbers. We're not going to talk about who we are. So I think just to move away from perpetuating that. Same with, saying things like you're being dramatic, overly sensitive, which again might sound, odd or, you know, different from some of the younger folks' experiences, but I think these are still things that I come across a lot of managers and senior leaders at companies who have that narrative, or like, oh, you're being dramatic. So yeah, move away from that. Yeah, and then the last thing I'll say here maybe is just that, not to immediately focus on solutions. I think we often tend to be really solution oriented in engineering. We're taught to be problem solvers, not just problem identifiers. We're uncomfortable with pausing, right, when we don't have a solution. And so often when someone comes to a manager, for example, and says, hey, like I experienced, discrimination or racism or whatever form of discrimination, is in question. And there often, is this like desire to like solve the issue, which no single engineer or person can solve systemic discrimination, right? So just to really, I think, move away from this like savior complex, or this desire to solve and save somebody right away immediately, and instead, I think, state your commitment to be part of, change, to be part of, a process, right? That could, be lifelong, could be, something that's long term, and just, be committed to being part of developing sustainable solutions over a period of time, as opposed to forcing something that isn't useful to anybody, like rainbow socks, on somebody just to make yourself feel better.
Amazing. Tessa, Ali, anything you wanted to add?
I am muted. I am pleased to say that when you ask about a rough experience in the workplace, nothing really comes up. Most of that, I haven't spent a lot of time in the workplace. I am 16 months of co-op. So it's yeah. In my short experience in like the professional engineering environment, I really don't have anything to say. Um, I run a pretty intense and dedicated volunteer group, and I think that a lot of our success in this world is that sometimes queer people become important. Uh, that's me. It's 2 team leads ago. Um, it's like there are queer people in charge of things, and that is a really great way to create these kinds of cultures, and to like build empathetic listening, and just having queer people around, and queer people who are respected. Like this relates to Arden's point earlier about coming like culture changing from top down. Like people respect me in these environments, um and so like they like people really care about what I have to say. Um and so I'm able to affect a lot of cultural shifts and cultural change that way. Um yeah, I don't really have a lot of bad things to say. I seem to have implanted myself into nice spaces, and I'm curious when that's going to change.
I think that's a great like thing though to hear that,
Yeah,
we've heard there's bad and there's also really, really good.
I'm
Um,
fine. Um,
Ali, you've been working, I think, longer than Tessa. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm also a little bit lucky in that I know that some of the bad things that I've experienced are not the worst. I have a lot of privilege. For those who haven't met me in person, which I guess is just you, Adele, on video here. I'm 6'2". I'm like a very massive person. I'm white. I come across as very masculine. And so I have a lot of privilege in that. So I'm not usually worrying about like personal safety when things are precarious. Oh, that's our title. Um, so there have been times when things are relatively uncomfortable, or like straight up terrible. Um, and I think for me, the biggest thing that I would love to see in decision making in the workplace or the way that things are set up. I mean, kind of just like beyond everything that Michelle mentioned and ardent, not tokenized. It's kind of similar to like the very broad thing that I spoke about before of just like have dialogues, be welcoming, ask questions. The discipline that Michelle and I are in, like civil and environmental engineering, we were both like we've both worked on dozens of different construction sites, and the beginning of our careers in undergrad, which we did, as an aside, we did meet in undergrad, but we didn't start dating until, or like get together until like many years later. So we weren't in the first year class, but just for context, we both had like, you get to your first year of school and the concepts course is like you're immediately thrown into field work and hiking around Columbia Lake in Waterloo, which I mean is not incredibly treacherous, but there's not really any discussion or full warning about any kind of outdoor gear you might need for inclement weather, any discussion on ability or accommodations. Now, I don't know if that's how the concepts course is still being run, but that kind of assumption that everybody is able-bodied and interested and willing to do this type of work definitely carries through into the workplace. And so I think that's something that has really impacted me in just assuming, and I see it impacting my colleagues or other folks who have intersectional identities who don't necessarily feel comfortable going to, or shouldn't feel comfortable going to rural areas of Canada, where there's very explicit flags being flown threatening certain members of our political leadership. And so yeah, I think that the biggest thing I would love to see is for managers or for coordinators, for whoever is in these roles of resource management to say, hey, are you cool taking on this role? Like, let's talk about what the safety context might be there. Let's talk about what subcontractors you might have to work with, and maybe let's come up with a plan of if you're being harassed on site, how are you going to exit safely? I've been working one-on-one with a colleague who doesn't just did like a lot of really inappropriate shit. And when you're one-on-one and you're 2 hours from the city, you can't really say, okay, I'm not gonna hang out, I'm not gonna hang out with you anymore. I'm not gonna work with you anymore because you're gonna get stranded or things like this. So it shouldn't be on the employee, especially the junior person, to raise unsafe work environments. This should be a dialogue that comes up at the beginning of projects or at the beginning of like a hiring process, even to see if field work is even in somebody's purview.
No, I love that. I'm hearing a lot of, if you're in a workplace and you have any sort of influence, whether you're the leader or the coordinator or senior or HR managers, there's already a responsibility to be a good leader for your employees. And that encompasses, providing supports and really being thoughtful about how their different identities will show up at work and whether that'll impact their workplace experience. We did get a question from the audience that I thought was really interesting because there's like a broad, again, you all graduated from Waterloo at different times. And so this is a question from someone who went to Waterloo before the folks on this panel. And so Engiqueers basically didn't exist. And so if you were a part of Engiqueers, can you talk about how your experience being part of Engiqueers, did it help you shape your identity? Did it help build community? What was it like?
Tessa, do you want to take this one first? I think it's just the two of us. You're muted.
You're still muted.
I'm muted again. I feel like your Engiqueers history leads into mine quite nicely.
Okay, sure.
I did take
So,
your.
yes. Yeah, so EQ almost, I mean, if you went to Waterloo before, I mean, if this person went to Waterloo before any of us, then it absolutely did not exist because Engine Careers was started, I think, in 2018, and which is when I also sh showed up. What was can you speak? Yeah. So I think for me, like the first thing that changed for me, the first thing that sort of questioned was my sexuality. And I was like, I think what I wanted was to see, because um, at the time, none of my friends were really queer, and I didn't have really anyone to talk to. And so I wanted to find some group of people in person that shared some experiences that I could talk to because I wanted some sort of mentorship or just to be in a space where I could be exposed to other people like this that isn't just online on the internet through Reddit or whatever. So yeah, like I found, I think Queers when I don't even remember how I found it, but I went to a meeting and I was absolutely terrified to start off. Um, but I very quickly realized, just for context, Queers is more of like a social group than like a professional development club or something. So it's just a bunch of people hanging out. There's a movie in the background or music. People are playing games or doing homework. And I think it was really meaningful to me because that was really the first time I'm like, oh, there are people like me and they are doing fine. They're doing great. Some of them are doing great because, again, like when I first realized that I wasn't cishet, there was this fear like I am absolutely screwed at Waterloo. And then I went to this place and there's a bunch of people who aren't screwed, or at the very least, they're not being screwed because they're queer. They're being screwed because they're in Waterloo Engineering and they have 3 midterms in 2 days or something. So like it was nice to have that sort of group to show me that it was okay. And after that experience, I wanted to sort of provide that for others as well, which is why I ended up being an exec and try to keep queers alive through the pandemic, which was a very difficult time because I was always looking forward to that day when we'd be back in person, and then they would be the baby gay who was like, me, but 3 years in the future, and I could be there for them, and there could be the space there for them. And so I think like EQ really did impact my life quite a bit. It made me come out a bit more and maybe a lot more comfortable and let me try things out with a safe group of people before I sort of tried it out, in a broader community. So it was great, and I'm trying to keep that feeling alive. So I guess Tesla can sort of speak to that.
Yeah, like yeah, that's what you did. I showed up to End of Careers Winter 2022 when it was still online. That was, I believe, the term that Claire would start a movie and then just leave. Um, but I remember that we had many late nights that term, just like chatting online. Well, they were late nights for me. I thought they weren't for you because you were in BC, I think. Um, but yeah, just chatting and like Arden became a lot of the mentorship that she's describing. Like it was really nice to see someone who through chatting is like a sort of similar parent situation. I think yours is a bit worse than mine. And like sort of like navigating this space in these weird ways. And then like yeah, doing fine, having friends. um and yeah, like joining interesting people, and then eventually Arden got old and I took her job. And I did exactly the same thing as Arden's describing. So like there is a handful of first years, one in particular that I've spent a lot of time with, just like chatting, working through things, like some of the like logistic, how do you get hormones through the university questions, some of the more like complicated ones. And yeah, exactly as Arden describes, it is so rewarding to receive and give the kind of direct mentorship that's like just being able to make it really obvious that you're going to be okay to new people is so nice. And like have hobbies and like have fun and struggle with school and be normal. It's quite paralyzing. A lot of the online impression of queer people is like pretty bleak. And so you find in-person queer people who are just like normal, doing fine, having normal struggles. It's yeah, meeting Arden was very reassuring. And I'm glad I've been able to pass on that sentiment.
I that's really positive and affirming. I think Ali, Michelle, if you had anything to add to this question that might be more precarious, that's also okay. I don't know if Queers existed when you were both in school.
Yeah, it was founded in 2013 at McMaster by
Uh,
Stephanie and Alexander Dow. And it soft launched, I think, here and there across different schools. And I think at Waterloo, there were a few, unofficial meetings held just amongst queer identifying or LGBTQ identifying students. And maybe I'll use this question or prompt to chat about my intersectionality awakening or learning experience, at least the most significant one that I had in undergrad, which was that there was I think it was advertised as Queers, like an unofficial Queers, like small gathering. This was in 2013. I was like going to be in poets, and this was back when like class reps would come and write on the board in the classroom, and so there's just a thing that was announced, and it was going to be in poets on this night at this time, and so I was like, oh, cool, okay. So I thought that was refreshing, and I planned to go, and so I make my way there. I get the poets. I open the door. There were 5 people, small group, on the couches. They were all white or white passing, at least by my perception, and they all sort of just looked at me for what felt like forever until one of them said, "Oh, this is Queers. What are you looking for?" And right, so just sort of, I guess the point was just I just sort of realized that as much as I felt, perhaps excluded in my, mostly cishet classmates, I also felt excluded in that moment when they just assumed that I was, in the wrong place, and that I wouldn't possibly be queer. And that felt pretty alienating. And I never went back to another Queers event ever until I was the keynote of last year's conference, like over, 12 years later. So that felt like a good full circle moment. But it really was, I think, a moment of feeling sometimes the compounding marginalization of these different identities, and I'm still pretty privileged, right? So imagine somebody who's disabled, physically disabled, and who have even more of these equity seeking identities and their experiences, right? So I think, and I know you had a question about intersectionality, Adele, and I think that's such an important lens. I think often we tend to, initiatives are siloed and we serve one group with this initiative, one group with this initiative, but what about all the many people, right? I was just using myself as an example, but what about the many people who, have a host of equity seeking identities? Where are they to be included and fully included for all of their identities at the same time, right? Not just one or the other, and feeling like you have to pick or choose, or always feel like you're included for one identity, but then sort of really stick out for the others. So just wanted to highlight intersectionality. It's important.
no, I hear
Yeah,
you. Go
I
ahead.
think it's worth mentioning that I spoke to someone recently who graduated this year. When she showed up to her first Careers meeting in 2020, she had exactly the same experience. She had a like, uh, yeah, maybe this is Careers. What are you looking for, or something? Like it was very similar. It's just like, yeah, super white. Careers has had that problem for a while. Um,
That wasn't me. That wasn't me. Just clarifying.
yes, sorry, yes, this is not written. That's a great thing to do at a spite though. Um, and yeah, like just completely identical. So it's worth saying that Enterprise isn't perfect. I think that we're better at that now. There's certainly a lot less like white majority, like the percentage is lower these days. Um, but yeah, that's something to keep paying attention to.
No, thank you. I really like that. Ali, did you have anything else you want to add about intersectionality and queers?
Honestly, no. I didn't really do anything with queers. I was pretty boring and also like really into the earth science stuff. So I kind of
Yeah.
avoided a lot of the engineering spaces in my own way. So nothing to add, unfortunately.
No, that's okay. Thank you all for helping answer this question. I think a lot of what I'm hearing is that, there's lots of work that's been done. There's still lots of work to do, even in like explicitly queer safe spaces, there's stuff that we can do to make them more supportive and safe for folks who have multiple intersecting identities. We are at the very end of our panel, so I will quickly share screen. It's just a ending slide. To thank our panelists. They are all incredible folk that do really interesting work and live very interesting lives. You can find most of them on LinkedIn. Tessa just has an email if you'd like to reach out, support Queers, throw money their way so they can continue to throw cool events. Would love that. If you're interested in doing more or attending more recent Engineering Alumni Council events, you can do so. Find us on all the things. But the big thing I wanted to end this panel with was a call to action. It's really easy to just, as an ally or someone who's not like explicitly out of the closet, throw on a little like pride outfit, like go watch the parade and like that's sort of it. You're like, oh, I did pride, I supported for June. But as engineers and alum, we have often the financial ability to do a bit more. So I would encourage everyone to, after this panel, throw some money at a local grassroots LGBTQ2, LGBTQ plus nonprofit in your area. Perhaps reach out to someone that may have been impacted by some of the negative things that have been happening across the country, or shoot an email or phone call, love phone calls, to your local MP to be like, hey, what are you doing this Pride Month besides showing up at the parade to actually do something? And so that'll be the note we end on today. Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. And we hope to see everyone who attended at another REAC and or UWaterloo Pride event. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thanks, Adele.
Everyone, thanks Adele for moderating.
No worries.